Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and about a month ago, I did a video on my wish list for the next Fire Emblem game. And the day this video goes public, February 27th, is Pokemon Day. So I thought it would be cool to do a similar video as my wish list for the next Pokemon game. I'm a lot less optimistic about the direction Pokemon is going than I am Fire Emblem. I make no secret about the fact that I absolutely despise Generation 9, and while Gen 8 I think is somewhat overhated, Alola, Galar, and Paldea together leaned into a lot of elements that I strongly dislike about the modern franchise. If you want a better idea of how I rank the games that are already out, there is a link in the description to my Pokemon games tier list, since I know different people enjoy different things about the Pokemon franchise. Before we dive in, I just want to say that the same general guidelines for my Fire Emblem video apply here. I'm going to try to keep my wants relatively realistic. There's definitely going to be some that are out there, but I think they're all within the realm of possibility of things that Game Freak might do. So even though I personally would love it if Game Freak abandoned the Predatory 2 version system, that's never going to happen, so it doesn't make my wish list. With that being said, my first wish probably sounds like a weird one, but I hope the game is delayed until 2026. We haven't heard anything about Gen 10 of Pokemon yet, and while it's possible that this is because the Switch 2 got delayed, my hope is that this is actually a response to the feedback Pokemon Company got from the bafflingly incomplete state that they released Generation 9 in. While there are plenty of things that I dislike about Scarlet and Violet outside of the performance issues, it's hard to argue that the bugs and performance are not the most eye-catching of Paldea's issues. And not only that, but they are indicative of a team that just does not seem to care. There are very basic oversights that easily would have been caught with any amount of testing, and I have no doubt that testers did notice and bring attention to these oversights. But they were not only still included in the game at launch, but also remained through the final update. To be clear, I don't even really blame the developers of Scarlet and Violet, so much as I blame Nintendo and Pokemon Company in general for their strict adherence to very tight deadlines, revolving around the anime and stuff like that. Pokemon has been on an annual release schedule for a while, and it has definitely affected the quality of the games, especially when they started giving up on third versions, which were easier to churn out since they mostly just involved updating a game that already existed. My hope is that by giving Generation 10 some time to cook in the oven, we will end up with an ultimately better product, while simultaneously avoiding crunch and burnout for the employees of Game Freak. But there's another practical reason to delay until 2026, and that is Pokemon's 30th anniversary. It would honestly be very fitting if the first generation to reach double digits fell on a major anniversary, and 30 years fits that bill. And with that in mind, I think it's possible that for an anniversary game, they might want to celebrate all of the generations that came prior. I've seen some people suggest that you should be able to explore every region, and personally, I think that's going a bit too far. Both in terms of the scale that you could expect a developer to put in, but also in terms of just how big a world can be before it's no longer enjoyable to navigate. Especially since the more recent Pokemon games have had a habit of not filling their worlds with the most interesting scenes. But I do think it would be neat if the Gen 10 games tied into everything that came before within the main story. As an unapologetic Gen 5 fangirl, my first thought is the Pokemon World Tour, potentially making that the center of the campaign. Rather than having all of your opponents come to a singular location, you could take a plane or cruise or some other vehicle to travel to iconic towns from throughout the series and fight iconic trainers who've shown up for the World Tour. Thus, you kind of get the feeling of exploring all of the different regions without having to go through a map that is way too big for the Switch 2's hardware. Of course, another popular way that fans have been hearkening for the games to call back to older regions is the removal of the so-called Dexit, which was a choice made in Generation 8 to stop having the games compatible with every single Pokemon from past titles, and instead limiting the Pokédex to only contain several hundred. A lot of people were very unhappy about this decision, but I'm going to be controversial and reveal that I'm actually a pretty fervent Dexit defender. This was always an inevitability for the franchise. We have over 1,000 Pokemon now, and gain more with every new game entry. Including every single one of them in the code for each new Pokemon game just places an unnecessary strain not only on the developers, but also on the hardware. Scarlet and Violet are already an unoptimized, terribly run mess. They would be even worse if they had to include every single Pokemon created in their memory. But I also think the need to include every single Pokemon ever created is unnecessarily restrictive to future design. As someone who plays Magic the Gathering and primarily spends her time in the Legacy format, I can tell you from experience that oftentimes seemingly harmless new mechanics end up interacting with long-forgotten older things in a way that is unintentional and broken. It's for this reason that most card games that last long enough end up having some sort of division between formats so that they can have a format that only includes the newest cards and thus prevent these unintentional interactions. And Pokemon has even had some of these weird instances. The move Assist and Prankster interact weirdly with Dive in order to create a scenario where it is almost impossible to do anything to win a battle. And a similar thing would have happened if Assist were still in the game when Gen 9 introduced Revival Blessing. In a similar vein, Gen 9's central gimmick, Terastallization, just does not work with the Pokemon Shedinja because of how Wonder Guard interacts poorly with you changing your typing. Shedinja is clearly designed with its typing as an Achilles heel because of how strong Wonder Guard would be if you could have a good typed Pokemon with Wonder Guard. And even outside of these specific examples, sometimes Pokemon are just so strong that they become really centralizing, either for in-game playthroughs or for competitive scenes. Magikarp and Gyarados frequently show up in the early game and overshadow other options for Water-type Pokemon. And from a competitive perspective, the Desolate Land and Primordial Sea granted by Primal, Kyogre, and Groudon were such game-warping abilities that it felt like they need to go so they didn't overshadow other legendaries in future generations. And that's before mentioning the ways that some of the generational gimmicks would interact with each other. Gen 7, including both Mega Evolutions and Z-moves, leads to incredibly swingy game states. And as Generations 8 and 9 added their own gimmicks in Gigantamax and Terastallization, I think it was a good idea to limit these mechanics, so you couldn't have run into a situation where there is a Gigantamaxed Mega Kangaskhan with Terra Steel. That being said, while I do think that Dexit and everything that came with it was a net good for the franchise, I understand why so many people were upset by it, especially those who liked bringing the same Pokemon from game to game as the generations went on. And so I think it would be kind of neat if Generation 10, rather than adding a whole bunch of new Pokemon, added a small number and focused instead on the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate type Everyone is Here, removing Dexit for one generation only, and allowing every single base form Pokemon to exist within the Dex of Gen 10. I wouldn't want this to be a permanent change, but I do think it would be a cool way to celebrate 30 years of Pokemon by including every single monster that we have so far. After all, everyone is someone's favorite. I imagine the ideal way to do this approach would be something similar to how Kalos handled their new Dex, introducing the smallest number of new Pokemon in any generation, and instead filling many of the routes with Pokemon from previous versions. This would unfortunately almost certainly lead to backlash when it is not maintained in Gen 11, but Pokemon fans love complaining, so they'd find something else to complain about in Gen 11, even if you didn't undexit for Gen 10 only. But when I talk about undexiting for Generation 10, I don't think the ideal scenario would be to include all of the generational gimmicks as well. As I said earlier, I think these gimmicks overlapping with each other could cause a lot of problems, both for competitive and in-game Pokemon. Instead, I think picking just one of the previous mechanics to bring back would be a better way to approach things. And with the upcoming Legends ZA being hinted at introducing new Mega Evolutions, it seems pretty obvious what would be the one to bring back: Mega Evolution. I will be honest, I actually really don't like Mega Evolution. I think it's the most boring of the generational gimmicks we got, as in most cases there's very little downside to just popping a Mega, and design-wise almost all of them look like what a 7th grader would do to make a Pokemon more badass. But if Game Freak is going to bring back Mega Evolution, then at least I hope it gets more incorporated into the main story. Despite the fact that Pokemon X and Y introduced Mega Evolution, the majority of Mega Stones were locked to post-game side quests, which were basically just a scavenger hunt where you had to go find sparkles at specific times of the day. There were a few you could get before fighting the Elite Four, such as Gengar or Abomasnow, but most of them are post-game only. And considering X and Y didn't have a particularly robust post-game, that means they're mostly just there for competitive. But kind of hilariously, Gen 6 managed to also have the opposite problem, since it handed you a Mega Lucario and a Mega Kanto starter basically for free, which I think is the wrong way of going about things as well. I think it would be cool to be able to use a large variety of Mega Evolutions before the post-game, but I don't think you should just be given them willy-nilly. Instead, my ideal solution would be to lock the stones behind side quests you can do before finishing the main campaign. That way, if you want to use one of the overpowered Megas, you can, but you have to work for it. I also don't think that Mega Evolution should be nearly as exclusive as it is. In both ORAS and X and Y, the player character is one of very few people who can use Mega Evolution. And while they do justify this within the story, it still feels weird that major bosses like gym leaders and Elite Four members do not get access to Megas. I know this is an incredibly basic ask, but I think enemy bosses should have access to Megas. Not just because of the difficulty, but also because it helps to leave a lasting memorable impression not only for the trainer, but also for the Pokemon. If the first time you encounter a specific Mega Evolution is with an enemy kicking your ass, then you're going to remember them. There's a reason that Miltank is still such an iconic Pokemon, despite being pretty mediocre overall. But speaking of difficulty, I would love a return of the difficulty systems that were featured in Black 2 and White 2. Although ideally, I would like them to be implemented better, because functionally locking hard mode to New Game Plus is already stupid, but locking easy mode behind a clear save file is even stupider. I know that Pokemon is meant to be a series accessible to all ages, and so I don't want the campaign to be some sort of grueling Kaizo hack. But I do think that implementing new difficulty settings would help to keep fans old and young engaged. And if this is meant to be an anniversary game, then I think celebrating people like myself who have been playing since the series' inception would be pretty stellar. And while we're on the topic of asking for incredibly basic things, I would love some voice acting in the next Pokemon game, especially if you're going to include characters based around musical sequences or cutscenes that play on their own without the player scrolling. I don't need every single dialogue to be fully voiced. There's tons of trainers and NPCs that have random lines that you can just have as text. But I think main character interactions should be voiced in order to create more immersion and connection to these characters. And especially cutscenes that auto-scroll text should have voice acting. I don't want to have to speed read to understand the plot of Area Zero. And on the topic of Area Zero, I really do not like open world. I'm not sure if it's here to stay in the mainline games or was just meant to be a gimmick for Generation 9, but I don't think it works in most games, and I especially don't think Pokemon did it well. Paldea is just incredibly empty, and running around it feels unsatisfying when there's not much to discover. As a result of this, I would much rather return to a semi-linear structure. I don't need something that railroads you as hard as Alola does, but I would like an ordered set of objectives, and have places that you explore be demarcated with what level you're expected to be at in that area. Although, I've spent a lot of this video shitting on Generation 9, so for my final wishlist item, I will highlight something that they did well, although Gen 7 did it better. And that is having boss fights that are something other than just a trainer battle. I think the Totem Pokemon were far and away the coolest bosses we have ever had in the series. And while I wasn't a huge fan of the Titan Pokemon, it at least was trying something in a different direction. As such, I would like the game to have us battle some sort of boss Pokemon that fit into this role of an ultra-powerful, untamable Pokemon that we need to fight against. It doesn't need to be a replacement for trainer-based boss battles. We still had gym leaders and the evil team in Generation 9, and the same is true for the Island Kahunas in Generation 7. But having all of the bosses be single battles against elementally aligned gym leaders has gotten incredibly stale. And so going back to exploring different types of bosses feels like a natural next step for the series. At the very least, the inclusion of more double battles rather than just a single gym fight would help to shake things up. And okay, I know I said that was the last wish list item, but I do have a bonus wish. This is something that is pretty unrealistic, but I think would be absolutely epic if Game Freak decided to implement it. One of the more unique legendary instances in the series is Manaphy and Fion, as they are technically related, although not through evolution. Manaphy is the only legendary Pokemon capable of breeding, although it does not produce more Manaphys. Instead, it produces a Fion, a different legendary Pokemon that is kind of the baby form of Manaphy, but cannot evolve into Manaphy. Instead, it is perpetually the child of Manaphy. And as a result of this, I've been thinking about what we could do with other legendary Pokemon around this same concept. Arceus is the god of Pokemon, and so if we introduced the ability for Arceus to breed and then give birth to a Pokemon that would functionally be the son of God of Pokemon. I picture this Pokemon having a signature ability that's kind of like an Aerialate variant, using its power to turn all of its water moves into poison-type moves. And this would not only be helpful from a competitive perspective, but also could help appeal to the ever-important Christian mom demographic, as many of them still think that Pokemon is devil worship. This Jesus mom could help get Pikachu out of Fox News headlines and into classrooms. And I just think that would be a net positive for humanity. But of course, that's just my opinion. What are your thoughts and wishes for the next Pokemon game? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you can't think of anything but still want to boost me in the algorithm, just say, I hope they had a button that lets you kill people like in the hit Pokemon game, Korosu. But for the record, I would always select no on the kill this person prompt for my patrons, because I'm very thankful and I don't want to murder them. So, thank you to Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Thyron, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alinby, Girlboss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Theythong, Andu, Reflect, A Clever Username of Lies, YLO1, George Granville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Floahe, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Toaster But Really, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Belwenska, Diesyke, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Gabe the Green, Control Dages, Roman Kormancic, Nick Nack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Some Trades, Heistic Lop, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey, and Lilzabeth. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon down below. For as low as $3 a month, you can get access to all of my videos a week early, with a couple of other bonuses for higher tiered patrons. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem, or in this case Pokemon. So if you'd rather, liking and subscribing are free and still help the channel a ton. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.